public safety, and national security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. So pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the committee resumes consideration of Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms. Today we have 2 panels of witnesses, and we'll start certainly with the first one. In this first hour with us today by video conference, we have from the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, we have Regional Chief Terry Teegee. From the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, we have Vice Chief Heather Bear, 4th Vice Chief. And from Women of the Métis Nation, we have Les Femmes Michif Optimistiquak, and I apologize already for that. Ms. Omeniho, President, if you could advise me on how to say these names properly, I apologize in advance. But anyway, so we will start with 5-minute statements by each group. We will start with Regional Chief Teegee. Please go ahead, sir. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. First of all, I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm calling from, the territory unceded, unsurrendered, continually occupied territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. I just want to thank all the committee members for attending today, also Vice Chief and the Métis Nation. Since we have a very short time, I just want to get into our concerns and also recommendations. I think we can all agree that we want safer communities, and that part of ensuring our communities are safe includes greater restrictions on access to weapons like handguns and assault weapons. The federal government's initiative to restrict freeze of sale or transfer of such weapons under Bill C-21 is commendable in this regard. However, we are very concerned about the lack of clarity with respect to red or yellow flag laws that are applicable to First Nations people, specifically on reserve and in First Nations communities. Handguns and assault style weapons are not used for hunting. However, the provisions of Bill C-21 will establish red, yellow flag laws, provide no guidelines or for how those new laws would apply to First Nations. This is significant as it may affect possession of firearms such as long guns or rifles, which are commonly and responsibly used by First Nations in our First Nations reserves and communities in traditional or treaty territories for hunting purposes. Parliament must not overlook this issue. If it involves possible restrictions to Aboriginal and treaty rights to hunt, which have been affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitutional Act of 1982, and also the United Nations Declaration Act, which was passed last year. First Nations women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA+ experience some of the highest rates of gender-based violence and inmate partner violence in the country, while at the same time, First Nations men and women are over-incarcerated at staggering rates. First Nations people remain Canada's fastest growing prison population, despite decades of well-intentioned, but ultimately ineffective criminal legal system recommendations and reforms that fail to redress systemic racism, sexism, and colonialism within the criminal justice system. First Nations people are already, as I said, over-incarcerated and over-policed at disproportionately high rates, and it's not clear how this proposed legislation may contribute to or to enable increased discriminatory police practices or negative interactions with law enforcement. Gangs certainly is a growing problem in First Nations communities and reserves, but this legislation provides no new tools for First Nations police agencies to address gang and gun violence, which is one of the ostensible objectives of the proposed bill. And certainly gang violence stems from many cases of chronic issues such as poverty, lack of services, unemployment, and intergenerational violence. Addressing these root causes would do more to reduce gang violence than imposing further restrictions on law-abiding firearms owners. Certainly, we look for more cooperation between non-Indigenous police forces, such as the RCMP and our First Nations, and also with our Indigenous police forces. Our recommended amendments is that the AFN recommends that the provisions of Bill C-21 dealing with red, yellow flag laws be altered to ensure that First Nations inherent and constitutional rights are respected. We also recommend to amend to clarify how red, yellow flag laws will apply to First Nations peoples, specifically First Nations reserves. We also recommend that oversight mechanism be included to ensure that Chief Firearms Officer consult with First Nations with respect to red, yellow flag orders and ensure they do not restrict firearms access to firearms commonly used in hunting. We also recommend that Bill C-21 be implemented to support First Nations police services and ensure that the resources they require to maintain law and order within their jurisdiction is provided, specifically in relation to root causes of gangs and gun violence. We also recommend that Bill C-21 be implemented to support First Nations prevention programs for youth in relation to gang violence and illegal guns. We also recommend that Bill C-21 be implemented to support First Nations prevention programs targeting gender-based violence and violence against First Nations women, girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ peoples. Fundamentally, the AFN asserts that the Government of Canada must conduct a process to obtain free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations as required by Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, now embedded in Canada's own act in this manner. Thank you for the time, and certainly we'll look forward to questions. Masicho.
We go now to Vice Chief Bear, please. Go ahead, 5 minutes. Pardon me, you're on mute. Still on mute. There, that should be good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm speaking from the beautiful unceded, unsurrendered Treaty 6 territory this morning. Thank you for asking the FSIN to appear as a witness on this important hearing regarding firearm legislation. The FSIN promotes and protects the interests of 73 First Nations in the province of Saskatchewan, and we are committed to honoring the spirit and the intent of treaties, as well as the promotion and protection and the implementation of treaty promises. I wish to speak today about the First Nations Inherent Treaty and constitutionally protected rights to hunt, fish, trap, and gather, and the continued struggle that our people face when it comes to systemic racism. The assertion of our right to hunt is fundamental to the treaty promises that were made to First Nations. We understand that Bill C-21 is being put forward to address public safety concerns that includes a freeze on hunting, red flag and yellow flag laws, provisions to prevent the smuggling and trafficking of illegal firearms, the prohibition on air guns, and changes to the criminal code. First Nations are aware of safety concerns when it involves the protection of vulnerable people and likely have no issues on the freeze of handguns or red flag laws, as our First Nations are plagued with poverty, addictions, gangs, and a drug crisis that seems to be worsening every day. It's one of the reasons that we call for resources to establish our own legal systems, which includes tribal police forces. When it comes to the safety of our nations, we support legislation that protects our women and the LGBTQ+ persons and our citizens. While we recognize the need to have the provisions to protect individuals who may be in immediate danger when it comes to the yellow flag laws and the criminal code changes, there are concerns that these provisions could be abused to target First Nation citizens. This is especially concerning for treaty sustenance hunters who will be impacted by the yellow flag laws when they choose to carry a license. The legislation provides that anyone can contact the chief firearms officer, a CFO, to report someone under the yellow flag regime. It could lead to the potential abuse of this section by having someone complain to a CFO with little information, thereby triggering an investigation. Everyone in Saskatchewan knows that tensions are high between private land users and treaty sustenance hunters. It is therefore concerning that some private land users could report anyone they see out hunting, which many do already, and the sustenance hunters could have this license revoked and his guns may be confiscated. When guns are confiscated from sustenance hunters, it impacts them and their families when they are merely trying to put food on the table. When guns are confiscated, it may impact the whole nation, especially for those who hunt for ceremonial purposes. In that sometimes we need only traditional food for ceremonies. These ceremonies include feasts. We also hunt to feed our people at funerals. We hunt to celebrate. We hunt for a lot of gatherings and occasions. So when you confiscate guns, you are doing a whole lot more than just taking away a gun. If there are no safety issues and there is no issue of domestic violence or any kind of violence, then taking away one's gun impacts our nations and our citizens' ability to assert our inherent and treaty and constitutional rights. We also view our guns as a tool with our First Nation sustenance hunters. Now we know this new law is about revoking a license, but many of our hunters do not get a license because the treaty did not require a license for our people to hunt. First Nations people have an inherent and treaty right to hunt and do not require a license or PAL to assert that right. Despite our hunters, we are harassed by conservation officers and the RCMP. While the intent of Bill C-21 is to address public safety and issues, I would recommend amendments to ensure that it is clear in the legislation that the treaty hunters do not need a PAL or a license when asserting our inherent treaty and constitutional right to hunt. This is the reason we did not agree with some of the Bill C-71. And this new legislation is another piece of imposed law that we have to deal with, especially when our people experience systemic racism. We know that our people are overpoliced and are overrepresented in the legal system and jails. This new law talks about an exception for sustenance hunters, but we know that if a First Nations person is asking for an exception to allow him to hunt, many judges would have a hard time letting that happen because our people are not treated fairly and are assumed to be guilty of something. Canada needs to do better at addressing the systemic racism that exists in the colonial system. Canada needs to change these systems so that our people are treated equally. Canada needs to work with us at bringing back our own laws. Canada needs to provide the resources so we can establish our own systems. Canada needs to be mindful of the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples as it relates to our ability to practice our ways of life. That includes hunting for sustenance and ceremonial purposes. Canada also needs to take note of Articles 2, 5, 11, and 15 and play an active role in preventing the ongoing systemic racism and injustices experienced by First Nations every day. If Canada can do that, we will achieve true reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chief. I now invite Ms. Amanijo to make an opening statement. 5 minutes, please. Seems we've lost Ms. Amanijo. We will try and get her back. In the meantime, we will, and when she comes back, we will invite her to make her statement. Meanwhile, I think we need to proceed with questions. So I apologize to anyone who has questions for Ms. Omanijo. We'll do the best we can do. So we'll start our questioning at this time with, actually, should we suspend for a minute? Tell you what, we're going to suspend for a couple of minutes to see if we can get Ms. Omanijo back. So meeting is suspended. has lost her internet, so she won't be joining us here. We will try to find an opportunity to bring her back, perhaps later in the meeting or perhaps the next panel or whatever we can fit her in. So apologies. So we will start our questioning at this point with Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, go ahead, please, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here and sharing with us your thoughts on this bill. I'm very glad to see that we're able to consult Indigenous leaders in Canada. I think that's very important for this bill and anything that may impact treaty rights and our constitutional rights, or your constitutional rights, pardon me. I was just wondering, first off, what consultations have been done with you or other Indigenous leaders that you may be aware of in Canada during the formulation process of Bill C-21. Are you aware of any consultations? Have you been consulted? Vice Chief Bear, you can go first. Oh, sorry, ma'am, you're on mute.
Pardon me, Vice Chief, you're there. You go.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, this has been somewhat troubling, and we have not had proper or meaningful consultation on any matters regarding gun legislation. And this seems to be, an ongoing concern among our leadership here within our region, especially when it has to do with hunting. I also wanted to point to in regards to handguns. At sometimes our trappers carry those as well, and we're looking, at the far north, especially, and there is virtually no knowledge of this amongst our land users, and in terms of who is being impacted on the ground, there has not been any meaningful knowledge or consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chief. And yes, I believe you're alluding to there are often trappers or those that are in the Canadian wild quite a bit that although they may carry a handgun and perhaps a hunting knife, but they also carry, or perhaps they carry a long gun and a hunting knife, but they also often carry a sidearm or handgun just for if there's an emergency situation with a large aggressive animal and you don't have enough distance to get your barrel out. So they carry a handgun. We've heard this quite a bit from those in this industry. So thank you for bringing that up and ensuring that's on the record. And then I would like to ask the same question regarding consultation with Regional Chief Tigi. Pardon me if I've mispronounced your name.
Yeah, there hasn't been any meaningful consultation or involvement with First Nations, at least on this level. I am also the portfolio holder for justice and policing for the Assembly of First Nations, along with Jocelyn Picard, and there hasn't been any meaningful consultation or engagement in regards to this bill. So that's very concerning, considering that it may have detrimental effects to our rights, title, interests, and also living up to the United Nations Declaration.
Thank you, Regional.
Thank you,
Regional Chief Tigi. I would like to also just elaborate. Both of you have mentioned a bit of a concern with C-21 and Vice Chief Bear. You'd mentioned this, or pardon me, with 21. Vice Chief Bear, you mentioned this with C-71 when you came before committee, that you're concerned that this will impact the ability for Indigenous peoples to pass along their culture of hunting and trapping. I would appreciate if you both elaborate on that as well. Could you, Vice Chief Bear? Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you for that question. If I can also circle back, in addition to lack of meaningful consultation, there has never been any capacity for engagements to do that properly as well. I apologize, but when it comes to, my goodness, can you repeat that question again? I have
just how when you've come before committee before on C-71, you voiced your concerns that C-71 may be detrimental to First Nations' ability to pass on their culture and their heritage in Canada. If you just want to elaborate of how C-21 may or may not have a similar impact.
Well, any time there's laws that apply to First Nations as it pertains to hunting, fishing, or trapping. There is always that risk, especially when guns are seized. I'm particularly concerned about investigations and that hunter hunts for not only uh, food for themselves, but we talk about ceremonies, we talk about culture, we talk about uh, rites of passage, and the infringement, of taking away that gun certainly inhibits that to happen, and therefore infringing on that constitutionally protected treaty and inherent right. And I sadly in Saskatchewan we do have those tensions. There seems to be an ongoing problem and issue with settlers and CFOs targeting our hunters, and adding more legislation I know would cause harm to hunters, where really we're looking for criminals here. The spirit and intent of this legislation is to address the criminality of guns with certain persons, and hunters are not out there committing crimes. They're out there defending poverty and feeding elders, feeding single parents, and of course just even that right. We were promised that we would have that freedom to hunt. Our hunting grounds would always be there, and by taking away that gun certainly an infringement. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We're going now to Ms. Demoff, please. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both our witnesses for being here today. Just as a point of clarification on the consultation, I know that Minister Mendocino met with the AFN, I believe it was the National Chief, the Métis National Council, and ITK prior to the bill being introduced. And I myself reached out to all three women's organizations and met with NWAC and Les Femmes Michef. I was unable to get a meeting with Pictudet, not for lack of trying. So there were discussions that were held. Regional Chief TG, we've spoken a few times on criminal justice, and I apologize if it didn't get through to you and you, Vice Chief Bear. One of the things that did come up in my conversations with the Indigenous women's organizations was concerns around gender-based violence. Regional Chief TG, you brought up that Indigenous women have the highest rate of gender-based violence across the country. And to quote what they said, a woman's right to live shouldn't trump a man's right to hunt. And that came from an Indigenous woman. That's not me speaking here. How do we balance the right to hunt with the firearm in the home and Indigenous women being at risk? Regional Chief TG, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I think it's in terms of consultation, at least for my region, I think, it's one thing to go to our head office at the AFN and speak to the national chief or even myself. The problem is getting down to the grassroots people and talking to how this law would infringe those practitioners, as stated by Vice Chief Bear, about how this would affect our hunters, our trappers, those people that utilize hunting as for part of their food, social, ceremonial purposes, part of their being from generation to generation. I think I think more needs to be done. Certainly, I've been tasked in terms of most of my attention, just in terms of things like this, is drawn towards looking at policing We do have a task force on policing looking at going from program funding to essential services funding, which is very much needed for our First Nations policing, especially with our tripartite agreements, our own police forces. I think, in terms of making sure that this is safe for women, I really believe that perhaps, this is the issue that is not going to be an easy one to deal with, especially in regards to homes where there is violence. And this is why at the AFN we're calling for more preventative measures and more resources so prevention can occur in regards to could be a long gun, could be handguns, could be any sort of violence within the home. And I think it speaks to the lack of resources within First Nations communities to make sure that women are safe, children are safe, is more of a preventative measure. So I think it's really something that needs to be looked at in terms of within the home and dealing with those issues and more preventative measure. And I think that's one of the things that we are recommending to the committee, more resources.
Regional Chief, we're in agreement on that, and we're also in agreement on moving forward on the First Nations policing. But I want you to know that we're completely in agreement on the prevention. But when we do have a firearm in the home and a woman, and one of the arguments I put forward with colleagues on the red flag provisions is that the argument is made that women can call the police to have a firearm if there's an issue with a firearm in the home. However, I know that many Indigenous women are not comfortable calling the police. And there was a case in the North where an Indigenous woman called the police to have a firearm removed, and she was arrested for breaching parole because she'd been drinking. So there's a lack of trust in police for women to call. And so the option of using the red flag provisions simply gives another option for people to have to move forward. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think more clarity on what these provisions, and that's what the recommendations that we have is to really understand how the red flag, the yellow flag provisions within this bill affects Indigenous peoples and within our First Nations communities need more clarity. And I think, those examples that you shared, and I certainly know there's very similar cases and very similar scenarios that I've heard of as well, in terms of the lack of trust with the RCMP and the lack of trust with policing is one of the matters that we're trying to deal with at the AFN, especially in regards to going from program service funding to essential services funding. The other matter that needs to be dealt with is to build a trust within the police force, because certainly it's not an easy task. So I think with this bill, there needs to be more clarity in how it affects our First Nations communities, but also our treaty rights, our rights as Indigenous peoples, and then especially in light of the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moff. C'est maintenant Madame Michaud.
Now, Ms. Michaud, 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. It's very much appreciated. I'll start with you, Chief TG. Well, you seem to be for some aspects of Bill C-21, but you did mention a few reservations concerning measures that have to do with the red and yellow flag provisions, and you're questioning their applicability in your community in particular. And perhaps you fear that First Nations rights won't necessarily be upheld. Could you elaborate on that? Specifically, for these red and yellow flag provisions, what worries you around their enforcement? Perhaps there's clarity lacking. What is not clear for you in the bill, the way it's written right now?
Well, I think what's not clear to me or clear to many Indigenous peoples is what far too often well-intentioned bills and laws can potentially be utilized against First Nations peoples. And I believe Vice Chief Bear gave a good example that, you know, perhaps there is a report on somebody, or there is somehow this is utilized to, I suppose, to potentially, I don't know, used in nefarious ways to really infringe on a person's ability to hunt, and or a person's indigenous person's ability to really, I think, to access sustenance, food resources. I think far too often, if there's too much leeway and it's unclear in terms of how this bill is going to be utilized, and the terms of, I would say, whoever the chief firearms officer is, far too often, you know, even within policing, we've seen it before, that perhaps the officer and the chief, I suppose, firearms officer utilizes this in a way that really punishes Indigenous people. So, to me, if the rules aren't clear, if there is too much leeway, those liberties would be taken and be utilized by people against our Indigenous peoples. And if it's not clear, you know, you know, liberties will be taken and be utilized in a way that really affects our rights to hunt, and that's what I'm afraid of. And I think it really comes down to whoever is utilizing this will most more than likely would be a firearms officer or a police officer, what those rules are, and how and when, where, and how to utilize this bill to make sure. But certainly, I agree with the safety aspect, because far too often what we've seen, and like many of you have seen in this committee, handguns and some other firearms are utilized in relation to the issues of, or into the utilization of gangs and whatnot, and that's always concerning for many First Nations as well.
Merci beaucoup. Je comprends vos préoccupations.
Thank you. I understand your concerns. Well, for me, it's quite clear. For example, if I look at Article 36, the final decision seems to be up to the CFO. The article gives the authority to the CFO to revoke a firearm if he is convinced that the person is involved in domestic violence or is stalking someone. And there are some exceptions that apply. For example, the need for a person to have a firearm to hunt or trap to ensure their survival or for their family. And you did express some reservations, and you're worried about this subsistence hunting or trapping right. But in the Act, it seems to me that these exceptions have been taken into account, and they'll be taken into account by the CFO. So do these exceptions reassure you, or would you like the wording to go even further? Do you find that this article in particular could infringe First Nations rights? I'd like to hear you speak about that a little bit more. In particular, this article, I understood your overall impression, but it seems to me that it's quite clear and that there are exceptions laid out in the Act. And yet those are the ones you're concerned with. So please go ahead.
Well, it could be, you know, some of the provisions within C-21 does set out what the task of the firearms officer will do. But I think ultimately, and this is the cautionary tale, because I mean, for example, there are many rules and regulations in regards to police officers, and yet there's a high rate of death and injury of Indigenous peoples in custody. And the reason I relate that to this is that we need to be clear on the firearms officer and what their duties are and what they can and cannot do. And I think that it really comes down to the officer and then making sure that there is a accountability with that officer, and also making sure that they follow the rules in terms of what they can and cannot do. Even though this law, I mean, even though this law could set out as much rules and provisions, it really comes down to the practitioner. And if that practitioner of the chief's firearms officer doesn't follow or takes liberties with this law and with this rule, what accountability measures do we have? So, I mean, we could have the best C-21 version that we can have, but far too often, sometimes, you know, depending on who the person is, and how good the intentions are, sometimes, and in our experience as Indigenous peoples, those liberties are taken to the next level.
I'm sorry, Chief, I'm
And,
going to have to cut you off there.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Madame Michaud, merci. We go now to Mr. Garrison. Welcome to the committee, and you have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I spent many years on the Public Safety Committee in a previous parliament, so it's nice to be back. And it's particularly nice to be here on a day when First Nations representatives are here. And I want to start by acknowledging something very important, I think, that was said by Vice Chief Bear. Certainly something I hear quite often from the First Nations in my riding, the Sauk Nation, Sciana Nation, Songhees Nation, and Esquimalt Nation, all point to the lack of capacity to participate in all the consultations that they're asked to participate in. And so I think that's a very important point that was raised here, that we have to provide capacity if we expect people to be able to participate meaningfully in consultations. And I thank Vice Chief Bear for that point. I want to stay with Vice Chief Bear just for a moment here, and I want to ask, in the discussions about red flag laws, it's been pointed out that they're another alternative to going to the police to deal with domestic violence because of a lack of trust. This might be useful to First Nations, but I wonder whether First Nations have any larger trust in the firearms officers or the court system. Is this really a solution? The red flag law is a solution that will be useful to First Nations in dealing with things like domestic violence?
Thank you for the question. I think that you know, when we're going into a very complex, and here again, you know, the need to do meaningful consultation and help shape the need for gun reform is, I think, requires a lot more, you know, consultation and discussion and thoughts when it comes to First Nations and the relationship with policing, especially when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and you know, violence against women. You know, often our women are not believed. We know that. We know that you know, we're already underserved when it comes to protection, and you know, we know that response time is probably the biggest grievance we have in terms of policing for women who are in vulnerable situations or our vulnerable population. You know, it's when it comes to gun control in red flag, yellow flag situations, you know, the one concern I had was, you know, I guess it goes deeper. I'm thinking about what happened in James Smith when you're looking at release plans, and you know, I know Regional Chief TG pointed to prevention, release plans, and knowing your people, and you know, try the need for policing to be essential to First Nations. Now I'm talking about on reserve. The one thing we lack here is authentic policing, where police officers truly care authentically. You know, the lack of culturally sensitive training, you know, and also, you know, being in the community to know your people. I think that's a huge gap. And well, along with the gap with addictions and mental health, those are all lacking within our communities. But we lack the capacity here to truly come to a conclusion who should have a gun or who shouldn't have a gun. But when you live in the community and you're part of a community, our leaders know. And I really think that there should have been more consultation on this matter when it comes to matters of violence against women, the critical issues that impact children and families. But we look at is this legislation really going to solve crime? I really don't think so. I mean, when you look at the licensing part of it, I really don't see this legislation impacting in a big way, but in some ways, prevention, you know, seizing guns and or prohibiting someone from having a gun that has a history of violence. I agree with that, but like I say, it's a tough question. But I think when somebody's going to commit a crime, they're going to commit a crime, and whether they have a license of a or not. I just really think we have a lot of work to do in terms of prevention and more programs to support women who are in violent situations, abusive situations. So sorry for going into the forest there, but you're asking a very complex question.
Thank you, Chief Bear. You remind me of something that longtime hereditary chief in the Esquimalt Nation, Andy Thomas, always said to me. And he said, we tell you what you need and you come back and consult us on some other shiny thing. He said, when in fact, you should just listen to us in the first place. And so I think both you and Chief TG have talked about the things that First Nations have put forward on policing and dealing with domestic violence. And now we're talking to you about something else altogether. And that was one of the frustrations that Chief Thomas always had.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison.
Out of time, okay.
I know we had a lot more to say on this, but there'll be another opportunity. So that brings our first round of questions to a close. We'll start our second round. This will have to be abbreviated, so we will end this round after Mr. Garrison. So we will resume this round with Mr. Shipley, I believe. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I prepared a whole list of questions, but I'm not going to ask any of those off my first one because Vice Chief Bear, you said something in your opening remarks that really stuck with me, and I'd like you to expand on it a little bit if you could, please. And I've written it down here as a quote. You stated, when you confiscate guns, you are doing a lot more than just taking away a gun. Could you expand on that and what you meant by that?
Well, when we take away a gun, we look in our how we view a gun from a hunter's perspective, a treaty rights perspective. It's a tool. It's a tool that we use to do a lot of things. When I talked about, for example, a rites of passage, the young hunters, the young boys, they go out to hunt, and you're not just hunting, you're teaching your child courage, you're bonding, you're passing on protocols, ceremonial protocols, how to look after your kill. There's the rites of passage, the reverence to the animal, the tobacco. So along with that tool comes a lot of teachings. Also, matters of safety, and when you take a gun away, you take that opportunity for that oral tradition to happen. The gun is also used to, of course, provide that sustenance to elders. When we look at poverty and how we supplement our incomes by, the wild meat, and also our food sovereignty, that way of life, that culture that we were promised at treaty, a sacred covenant was made that we would always have that way. And to take away that gun takes away so much of who we are and where we come from. And that's what I meant by that statement. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for expanding on that. My next question actually I'd like to address to both Vice Chief Bear and Regional Chief TG. Quite frankly, do you feel Bill C-21 will assist with any crime issues in your communities? Whoever would like to start, I'd like to ask both.
I think in a criminal perspective, quite simply, it's perhaps it will, and it comes down to Bill C-21 utilized in urban centers, and also the fact that more often than not, there is a connection between our First Nations communities and urban centers, and many of our young people get involved in gangs. And if this prevents the use of handguns and really mechanized weapons within gang violence, perhaps it will prevent. But at the same time, as Vice Chief Bear said, if there is a will and a way for some of this to happen, more often than not, it does. And but certainly, like you, the hope is that it prevents some of the violence of gang violence. I think that's one of the things that we're really concerned about. Thank you.
Is it my turn here? Okay, yeah, I guess my response there too, I just have a, when you look at the reality, I really, from a First Nations perspective, there again, I've stated that one of the biggest grievances First Nations have is response time. So whether or not having a license to carry a gun is going to make a difference when it comes to violence with guns, I really don't see the legislation impacting on reserve. And there again, off reserve, when you're looking at some of the gang violence, the access to guns, I really don't think this legislation is going to curb a criminal when they're intending to do crime with a gun. They're not going to stop and think of whether or not they have a license. They really don't care. So I think the biggest, the ones who are going to be impacted the more, I believe, in this legislation are the hunters and maybe the trappers in terms of the handgun use. So I really, quite frankly, I don't believe this legislation is truly going to do what it was the spirit and intent of it in terms of resolving crime. Maybe a small percent, but a criminal is going to do crime whether they have a license or, in terms of guns. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shipley. We'll go now to Mr. Nur Mohammed. Mr. Nur Mohammed, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Vice Chief Bear, I'd like to start by asking you, because one of the things that, obviously we want to try and prevent is domestic violence. And one of the concerns, of course, that has been raised by many women's groups is the preponderance and the presence of guns in homes has led to additional cases of violence against women. And my understanding is that Indigenous communities are no different in this regard. Can you share a little bit about your experiences? And Chief TG, maybe you can also weigh in on this, in your communities of where guns in homes have caused challenges related to domestic violence.
Well, I think, in terms of First Nations, because we are probably the most vulnerable of the vulnerable in this country, there is always that worry, that our children, our families can be harmed, when it comes to matters of guns. The problem that we have, I guess, is, when women often report domestic violence and they're never believed. And I think, a lot of the progression here to the point of, violence with guns, can be probably prevented, at a very early stage. But, there again, we're getting to a very complex, when we talk about gun safety, and our women and children being safe, and men, of course. It does happen vice versa. I just, until we really take a good look at this gun legislation and whether or not it's going to stop domestic violence when it comes to guns. I guess that's the question. Maybe in a small percentage it will, but I would rather look at prevention and tribal policing. Our police forces on reserve would know our communities, so know our people.
Right.
So
Okay. But before I go to you, Chief TG, just to follow up on that, though, do you think that it is a good idea to take? Do you not think it's a good idea to take away guns from those who are engaging in domestic violence in the home?
oh, absolutely. I have no problem with that.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I mean. When you know your people, you know who should have access to a gun and who shouldn't. I do agree with that in some instances, but like I say, my worry is that with some of the systemic racism and what we face with our hunters, there's another narrative that this would be, open the door for more of that harassment.
Sure.
And for that to happen for people who are innocent hunters.
Thank you for that. And I think we're all in agreement that we want prevention is very important. I don't think there's any question there. And I think it's also important that we address issues of systemic racism. There's no question about that. So thank you for sharing that with us. Chief TG, very briefly to you, your experiences in terms of guns in homes and domestic violence. And then I'm going to give the remainder of my time to my colleague, Mr. Chang.
Thank you for that question, and certainly it's a very difficult one. Myself, if you're talking about communities, my uncle was shot and murdered by gun violence, and that was over 30 years ago. And certainly at that time there was none of this laws. The relations with police was perhaps not as good, but I think what has changed is the relationship with the RCMP, is more involvement with our chiefs and council, knowing your community. The issues at that time was really, I think it was the issues of unresolved issues of residential school, of the ongoing issues of the next generation dealing with the violence that was brought back to the communities. It was unresolved issues with mental health addictions that really contributed to the death of my uncle. So I think we're getting better. I know in my community there is preventative measures. There is more opportunities for our youth. There is more really coming down on the issues of drugs within the community, but that's not the same for all communities. We're not all in the same place, and I think speaking to this, that perhaps like some of these issues, albeit Bill C-21 has good intentions for stemming the tide of gun violence and the use within gang violence, I think the unintended consequences is what we're really voicing here with my colleague from FSIN about those First Nations who are law-abiding citizens. They're utilizing this as part of their traditions, a part of their treaty, a part of their culture, especially when it comes to subsistence hunting and trapping. Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed. We go now to Madame Michaud. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur.
Ms. Michaud, 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Vice Chief Bear, I'd like to continue with gang-related violence. I read in an article in the Globe and Mail, excuse me, I made a mistake, 2.5 minutes. Okay, thank you. The Northern Saskatchewan First Nation reinstored the state of emergency following a gang-related incident, and there were drugs involved as well. The nation asked the federal government for help to deal with this crime. And you said,
Community, they're in a crisis, their school, their children, they deserve to be safe, they deserve to be protected from gangs, and I call on the gangs to please stop what you're doing and quit selling death to our people. Avec la situation actuelle dans laquelle
with the current situation in many communities where there are victims from gang-related violence, do you think that C-21 will have a positive impact and help settle these problems? I know there's a section of the bill that seeks to improve the situation related to firearms, illegal and trafficked firearms, and there's maximum sentences. Mind you, I don't know that that's going to make a big difference, but I'd like to hear from you. Do you think that C-21 will have some positive impact on gang-related violence?
Well, I guess, and thank you for listening and hearing, what has been going on in the North and in many of our communities. When you look at will the legislation have a positive impact on what's happening as an example in the North? I can't really say for sure because, like I say, when someone is doing crime, they really don't care. I think the laws that are in place, when you look at to seize guns when crime is happening, when you're dealing with drug and gun related violence, there's already laws in place to take that gun away. I mean, I just people doing crime really are looking at the law. They're already doing the crime, so I really don't see how this bill is going to prevent those things from happening here again. I think we're looking at mental health, we're looking at addictions, and I think we need to really focus on preventative measures. For example, the release plans, not only for people coming out doing violent crimes from the jails, but also, in terms of mental health. I think we would do better there.
Merci, Madame. Go now to Mr. Garrison, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to assure both witnesses that I'm hearing very clearly the emphasis on prevention and the emphasis on increasing capacity of First Nations policing. In your opening, Chief TG, you expressed concerns about the red flag laws, in particular, and the possibility of infringing on treaty and Indigenous rights, and you suggested they needed to be amended. So I'm going to ask you a very specific question because I'm trying to get a clear picture here. If those sections on the red flag laws are not amended, would you prefer to see them removed from this bill?
Well, that's something on in terms of your committee, whether this is succeeding in terms of its intention. So I think having those amended to make sure that our First Nations are involved. I think, when it comes back to the red and yellow flags, it's really important to communicate how to utilize it, how this is going to affect Indigenous peoples, and especially with free, prior, and informed consent of the United Nations Declaration, which is law. I think a better engagement of how those laws can be amended to make sure that this bill doesn't have unintended consequences. So I would say if it isn't amended, there's quite possibly, I think there needs to be more engagement in terms of how this can be better reflected for current realities of the United Nations Declaration. So I think, I don't know, it's really up to you, to the committee on whether you take our recommendations or not.
So I guess you're really giving us a yellow light when it comes to those, and saying that
giving you a red flag.
Yeah, exactly. I would ask the same question to Chief Bear. If we're not successful in committee in amending those sections, would you prefer to see them dropped for further consultation?
Oh, absolutely. I think that when we're looking at the shaping, the needs of guns and reform, especially with the impacts in terms of the infringements, potential infringements. I think they're great, and those are treaty rights that are, constitutionally protected. And I also, when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent and pointing to the, UNDRIP, I think that, we need to do better there. And, while at the same time, I think there is a healthy process, when we're talking about creating that narrative in that conversation, how better to protect our women, children, and men from gun violence. And I think a lot of good could come out of those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison. So that wraps up our questioning for this panel, and I appreciate the panel for being here today to share with us your experience, your knowledge, and your wisdom, and helping us with this study. So with that, I will suspend, and we'll bring in the next panel. So thank you. I call this meeting back to order. So with us by video conference for the second hour, we have, as an individual, we have Francis Langlois, professor and associate researcher, Observatoire des États-Unis, Raoul Danduran, chair of strategic and diplomatic studies. We also have Dr. Kylan Langeman, assistant clinical professor, Department of Medicine, McMaster University. And I will note that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests. So we will start with inviting each witness to provide an opening statement. We will start with Mr. Langlois. Please go ahead. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will use English just to be quicker. So thank you very much for inviting me. I've been studying firearms culture, legislation, and technology for many years. I'm here to talk about ghost guns, firearms that are not identified by a serial number. And what I want to say is that they are a growing public security issue. They have been found a bit everywhere in North America, but here in Quebec, in March 2021, a young man was arrested at the border with 248 ghost guns that were a Glock 17 replicas, and they are coming here either through the border or they are made here. And I will propose a few ideas to help curb this growing threat to Canadian public security. And one of the main idea I will defend is to broaden the definition of what is a firearm, because for the moment, essentially, serial numbers are on one part of the firearm, the receiver. And so people can either print or make a receiver from polymer or metal, and then they order the parts from the United States where it's legal to produce such parts. And for at least the American law, they are not considered as weapons or a barrel, but one barrel bought online is not considered as a weapon. A slide is not considered as a weapon. So if somebody buys it, there is no verification. So they are quite easy to get, and even perhaps to get here. So that's what I will talk about.
Thank you, sir. We go now to Mr. Langevin. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for letting me present my research regarding Canadian firearms legislation and its association with homicide, spousal homicide, mass homicide, and suicide in Canada. I am an assistant professor of medicine at McMaster University and an emergency physician in Hamilton. I serve as an academic peer reviewer in the areas of firearm control, homicide, suicide, violence, gang deterrence for academic journals, and have 4 peer-reviewed publications on legislation and the effects on homicide and suicide in Canada. I have submitted my studies and a report regarding the current proposed legislation to the committee. However, I will briefly summarize it. C-21 proposes 2 significant regulations, an essential ban on handgun sales and a regime for allowing emergency firearms prohibition orders. My research on previous Canadian legislation is applicable in answering the question of what the effects of this legislation may be. Since 2003, the number of restricted firearms, including handguns, has doubled from 572,000 to 1.2 million. However, the rate of overall firearm homicide has not increased, nor has the rate of homicide by handguns. While there has been a recent increase, similar to the levels of the early 2000s, the rates of homicide has actually fluctuated about a steady mean when statistical analysis is performed. You can see my graph attached to the brief. In the 1990s, legislation banned over 550,000 firearms, many handguns. However, research has demonstrated that there was no statistically significant benefit on homicide, spousal homicide, or mass homicide rates from this. While suicide by firearms decreased, hanging replaced it, and no overall changes in suicide occurred. Other jurisdictions, such as Australia and England, have also applied significant controls to handguns, and no statistically significant changes in homicide rates were detected. In terms of emergency prohibition orders, currently a system exists where anyone can report a firearms owner to the CFO. I personally have been involved in this process as a physician with psychiatric patients and have found the response to be quick and efficient regarding the removal of firearms and licenses. For physicians, there is currently a system where one can detain a patient under an application for psychiatric assessment if one has justified concerns for homicidal or suicidal intention. I utilize this method regularly. At such a point, we can explore risk reduction with suicidal patients. I have concerns of expanding this process further in terms of sharing confidential patient data with the CFO without consent. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada has also warned about this in their 2001 report on the firearms program. In the 1990s, Canada made these changes, allowing people to report concerns to the CFO and allowing the CFO to revoke licenses and confiscate firearms. Unfortunately, research demonstrates these Canadian regulations have had no effect on homicide, spousal homicide, or mass homicide rates. Interestingly, a recent study on protection orders in California also revealed no associated benefit from similar regulations. In summary, the evidence so far demonstrates that handgun laws will have no associated reduction in homicide rates or overall suicide rates, that the replacement of the current emergency protection system is redundant. The proposed recent gun bans and new regulations may well cost billions of dollars to implement and enforce. The current finance minister announced recently that Canada will need to adopt equal cuts for all new spending. Nova Scotia needs to invest $500 million into its healthcare system. My city currently faces emergency wait times of 6 to 8 hours. It takes me months to have a psychiatric patient seen by psychiatry. The money being considered for these firearms programs would have a greater effect being invested into healthcare where lives would benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll start our rounds of questions now. We'll start with Mr. Lloyd. Go ahead, please. Mr. Lloyd, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start with Dr. Langman. We've had a number of witnesses that have come before the committee from the various sport shooting disciplines, concerned that this legislation is not going to exempt their sports. We've had other witnesses who've come in and said we cannot allow these sports to be exempted because it's a threat to public safety. Does your research indicate that would you conclude that an expansion of an exemption allowing IPSC or mounted shooter clubs will in any way have a negative impact on public safety?
Like I said before, over 550,000 firearms were banned, many of them handguns, short barrel handguns in the 1990s, and there was no associated benefit from that. So I don't see allowing a relatively small, tiny group of users to have handguns would have any effect, especially when recent reports have shown that about 85% of handguns used in crimes are imported from the United States illegally.
Now, kind of jumping on that, we had Mr. Langlois here talking about the prevalence of ghost guns, which is something we're very concerned about. It feels like traditional approaches to constrict the supply of guns. I think C-21 is definitely a traditional approach. Given the reality of ghost guns, do you think that C-21 will actually be effective in any way at reducing gun violence in Canada?
I don't think so at all. I mean, the problem with a lot of the studies that are performed is that there are so many substitute methods for obtaining firearms. Even US studies, the ease and ability to transfer firearms across borders through various states makes a lot of those studies somewhat inconclusive as well. So I can't see this having any benefit at all.
Earlier in the study, we had witnesses from the Doctors for Protection of Guns, and they claimed that C-21 and other similar gun control policies will significantly reduce the overall rate of suicide in Canada. They said they had strong evidence. They said they would provide it to committee. I just reviewed this morning. They haven't provided that evidence to committee yet. Other than your work in the Canadian context, I haven't seen any peer-reviewed study to suggest that this kind of legislation will reduce overall suicides. Are you aware of any evidence that in the Canadian that suggests otherwise?
So for Canada particularly, no. A recent Canadian Medical Association journal article came out showing that while suicides do seem to go down in association with gun legislation, overall suicide stays the same. They ranked my studies actually as the highest ranking studies within their review. Other studies from Australia have also shown that while while firearm suicide rates may decrease, overall suicide rates don't change. There's multiple studies involved, and I've submitted those in my brief to this committee. The ease and ability of hanging is 80% as effective at suicide, similar to firearms. When someone has serious intent, it's almost impossible to deter them. And unfortunately, as physicians, we even have no clinical decision rules or ability to really predict who's going to commit suicide. I would strongly suggest that, I mean, when I see a patient and they own firearms and we discuss risk reduction, and that means either the CFO removing the firearms or them giving them to their friends, the second thing I can give them is a referral to psychiatry about 8 months later.
That's yeah, and that's something that you mentioned. We're talking about with C-21 and with the gun buyback that the government's contemplating potentially in the billions of dollars. Do you think that money would be far better spent on addressing the mental health challenges that are coming in Canada? Would that actually have a greater effect on reducing suicide, reducing domestic abuse, and reducing overall gun crime in this country?
It would have a far greater effect. I've been coming here for 10 years. People have said to me that they are increasing funding, but so far our wait lists have increased, especially over the last 2 years.
Finally, I guess we've had some witnesses who said they use single action revolvers for their sports. We have people who use black powder, muzzle loaded, like basically like pistols from like the 18th and 17th centuries. These are all being considered handguns under this legislation. Does your research indicate that those kinds of handguns are far less likely to be used by criminals?
My research doesn't look into that, but other research has looked into what criminals prefer. They typically do prefer the firearms with ejectable magazines, and that has changed over the years. Previously, they did use revolvers. Restrictions in DC and other places in the United States, restrictions in Australia, there's been no associated benefit in terms of reduction of homicide.
So we know there's already a very low likelihood that a licensed handgun owner is going to commit a crime, but would you say it's fair to say there's an even far lower likelihood that somebody who uses like a muzzle-loaded black powder firearm or a single action revolver is at even lower risk of being a public safety risk? Would you say would you conclude that to be the case?
I would suspect that's the case. I don't have evidence for that, but I would strongly doubt it.
Thank you. Do I have much time left, Mr. Chair?
12 seconds.
Okay, well, I want to thank the witnesses. Sorry I couldn't get to you, Mr. Langlois, but I found your stuff on ghost guns very interesting.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. We'll go now to Mr. Van Bynen. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the input from the witnesses, particularly for those witnesses who are experiencing the outcome of gun violence in the operating rooms and in the emergency wards. My first question will be to Dr. Langman. I understand that you appeared before the Guns and Gangs Committee, and also I'm aware that you did complete some research and that it indicated that the impact, or did that research reflect the impact of Bill C-21, which included background checks and forfeiture of firearms to the Crown under prohibition orders? What was the date of your research? What was the time of your research?
So my research has looked at the years over 1974 to 2016, during which that time there has been a number of legislation and regulation implemented, some of which involves licensing implemented in 2001, and unfortunately there's been no evidence that there's been any reduction in homicide rates or spousal homicide rates with that, as well as the confiscation
Dated
of firearms.
2016 is the evidence that you were looking at. I just want to, I'm facing a very difficult challenge here, and that is trying to equate what you're saying and balancing that with what I'm hearing from other witnesses as recent as last week, who have a very, very different opinion. I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Namja Ahmed, her testimony. Dr. Ahmed is also a professor of surgery at University of Toronto. She's also a trauma and emergency surgeon. And she's indicated that gun injury and death is an urgent public issue. She also indicated that the Canadian Medical Association declares firearms-related injuries and fatalities as a major cause of premature and preventable death. Do you agree with the Canadian Medical Association with that statement?
Yeah, of course, firearms injuries are a serious issue. What we're talking about today is legislation, and I've done research on that. Dr. Namja has not, and this is what the evidence shows. I can only bring you what the evidence shows.
And I appreciate what you're saying in your research, but to me, what you're saying is that the existing legislation hasn't been as effective as we would like it to be for the outcomes. And so that would lead me to conclude that what we should be doing is considering the provisions of Bill C-21 to enhance and strengthen the safety measures that we're trying to create. Now,
sure, and that's the point of my research, is to address some of those issues. And like I said, in the 1990s, over 550,000 firearms were banned, which includes handguns. Australia also banned handguns, essentially restricting them to people like Olympic sports trainees. And there's been no reduction in firearms homicide from that. I would suggest to you that you may wish to pursue other methods, such as investing in youth deterrence programs, getting at youth when they are at risk of developing criminal behavior. Those diversion programs have been shown to have significant evidence in reduction of homicide later on, as well as criminal violence. Even the Public Safety Canada conducted a report in 2012 showing that some of the small programs that are performed in Canada had a reduction of 50% in recidivism in juvenile offenders. So I would suggest that what you're doing probably isn't working because you're focusing on firearms owners who tend to be extremely low risk. They've been licensed, they've been screened, they're monitored daily. And so your gain from spending a lot of money in those areas is very low, considering that those licenses, for example,
thank you, Doctor.
Licensed firearm owners.
I do want to just state that we did invest $122 million to support 47 gang prevention and diversion projects. We invested $250 million in building safer communities. So we are making those investments as well. But I do want to turn to another item, and that is something that you alluded to in your introduction, and that is the concern about the confidentiality if you have a concern that surfaces with your patients. Now, I understand that mandatory reporting is difficult as it crosses several jurisdictions, including the rules that doctors impose upon themselves through your regulatory college. But would you be supportive of a federal requirement for mandatory reporting for a physician if there is reasonable grounds that a patient may pose a danger to themselves or to others, so that they would report that belief to the peace officer, firearms officer, a chief firearms officer, for use as evidence to expropriate and initiate an ex parte transaction to remove those weapons?
So for violence, that already exists. If you have a significant concern that a patient is about to commit homicide or violence, you have a duty to report to the police.
Okay.
In terms of suicide, well, you asked me two questions, and let me get into it because that's a different subject. So what you're asking me to do as a physician is to send the CFO all of my patients who have submitted any form of depression or suicidal discussion, may not be intent, to the CFO and them to keep a record of this. That's a significant amount of patient records that is being submitted to a third party. And you can imagine, I mean, there's already been release of some patient records, including these psychiatric detention orders, to the American government.
I'm going to be running out of time, Doctor, but in
You're
Quebec,
already out of time, sir.
Sorry?
Thank you. You're out of time. Madame Michaud, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Michaud, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Mr. Langlois, and thank you for having accepted our invitation to testify before the committee. I think that your expertise is very appreciated here, and I'm happy that the committee can benefit from it. One of your areas of focus is firearms in Canada, but also in the US. Since the tabling of this bill, and I imagine it's the same thing for my colleagues, we've been receiving a lot of emails and comments from citizens, and they think that C-21 will remove their ability to carry a firearm, as if we had something like the Second Amendment in the US. And yesterday, or the other day, Police se souvient was here and said that they were worried about this gun culture, American-style gun culture that's becoming more and more popular in places like Montreal and other big Canadian cities. Young people are joining more gangs, and some young people want to get a firearm to protect themselves. And so I'm wondering, do you think that some ideologies or American influences around firearms are sort of infiltrating Canada? And do you think that C-21 could help protect us against that, or not necessarily? Thank you for the question, Ms. Michaud. Yes, we are seeing here in Canada a discourse that is very close to that of the US. Sometimes some individuals defend the right to carry and use a firearm, and they use arguments that are taken directly from organizations like the National Rifle Association. That being said, you're right, at the Supreme Court of Canada and of Ontario, it was the federal right was reaffirmed to legislate on the matter of firearms in Canada. And in Canada, firearms possession is a privilege granted by the government. And a side note, this matter of ghost guns limits or removes the decision-making power of the Canadian government as to who can possess a firearm and what kind of firearm is legally available in Canada. So that's it for that side note. So yes, we are hearing a discourse and a firearms culture that has been imported from the US, if you will. And yes, this happens through social media and so on. Now, nonetheless, as was stated earlier, portion of crime is committed by these firearms. And the reason why people are arming themselves is to protect themselves. Now, a number of studies have been published on violence in the US, firearm violence. Patrick Sharkey, for example, or Thomas App. These are recent studies that show that what people want most is self-protection. And then there's the cultural aspect, which provides a certain status. So if you have a firearm, it gives a certain status to the person. And of course, they show their firearm. And the problem this creates, and other studies have shown this, is that in the event of an altercation, if there's a gun, especially if it's an illegal gun, there is a strong chance that it be used. And these are the firearms that we hear about in the media, or these are the ones this is what we see being used in the big cities in the US, but also in Toronto and Montreal, Vancouver, and so on. So this culture is indeed imported, but I would say that the idea of a firearm being a solution for different problems, whether it's criminals or others, this is from the US, yes. Of course, those ideas have trickled down to us here in Canada. Thank you. Very interesting. You talked about ghost guns, a phenomenon that is more and more evident. Now, C-21 doesn't deal with this. I know that you have a few proposals to give us. I know that the government seems to be open to making amendments to the bill. Otherwise, I'd like to do so. What do you recommend to us to legislate in the best possible way in regards to these ghost guns? One of the big problems is the fact that the only part to identify firearm is the serial number. Pardon me, I'll say it in English, but the lower receiver, the cross of the pistol, and those of assault weapons. Most parts of a firearm have a serial number provided by the manufacturer. So the idea is that since only the receiver is being used to identify the firearm, well, it's important to make sure that that part is printed out at home, either with a 3D printer, or it needs to be manufactured in metal using a machine. So once that's done, the other parts can be purchased, and there is no verification. There's really no checks in the US, and there's an industry of 80 polymers, as they're called. Of course, they're not quite done because you have to assemble the unit and you have to, drill a few holes. But these firearms are easy to make there. And of course, we can't keep an eye on what's happening in the US. However, at the border, the checks would have to be bolstered. And then there's Canada Post, for example. There need to be checks to see what people are ordering. If somebody starts regularly ordering, barrels or other parts for pistols, well, those parts need to be looked at to see if they're part of a firearm. That's important. So the firearm is more than just the receiver or the handle. It's also the receiver, the barrel, and so on. Thank you very much. Sorry, sir, I'll have to cut you off there. Thank you, ma'am.
If you please, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Dr. Langman, you say you have presented research, which I don't dispute, that is very well respected, covering the years 1974 to 2016. And in that research, you found there was no effect on homicide and suicide rates by the various gun control measures. What I'm having trouble with is a bit of a leap you seem to make, saying, therefore, no future measures restricting or controlling can have any impact on gun violence in this country. Is that actually what you're arguing?
It's not a leap because you can extrapolate from the fact that a large number of handguns were already banned in the 1990s and there was no effect. There's been a large increase in the number of handguns owned by Canadians over the last since 2000, and there's been no similar increase in the rate of homicide. As well, Australia adopted quite similar legislation that you're proposing as well in terms of complete handgun bans, and they also demonstrated no effect in terms of homicide reduction. So I think we can extrapolate from that you're probably not going to see much of a benefit, if any benefit at all, from your legislation. It's quite an expensive legislation. You might want to consider some other methods that have been proven to have better effects, especially, like I said before, on youth deterrence.
I guess you've run into another leap that I don't share with you, where you're saying we have to choose between the preventative measures and gun control measures, because we're in a wealthy country where everybody paid what they actually owe. We can afford to do both. I want to talk specifically about some more statistics, and that is both as a member of the Justice Committee, I have heard this, and we've looking at recent evidence here on more narrow studies. Evidence has shown that a woman is 5 times more likely to be killed as a result of domestic violence when there's a gun present. And we've heard that adolescent suicide rates increase by 3 to 4 times when a gun is present in the home. That seems to be at odds with your more general studies. Would you say that those studies are invalid, or that they're perhaps dealing with a more specific question and we should pay attention to those studies?
I would say, well, first of all, you need to read the American Journal of Public Health study, because that study also showed that a woman who owns a firearm for protection is less likely to be killed. So though that was a cross-sectional study, those are the weakest studies of all. It was an American study done on American women. My studies are not cross-sectional. They are quasi-experimental studies. So they're time series studies. They have a control, all right, and an experimental effect. And I've looked at spousal homicide. I've looked at the legislation with those studies, and there's been no reduction in spousal homicide with any of these legislations, as well as the prohibition of many firearms. Firearms owners are, I mean, in the last 10 years, looking at some of the evidence, maybe 0.01% of firearms owners have their licenses confiscated for domestic reasons. So I don't expect there to be any effect from the legislation you're proposing. In terms of adolescent suicide, once again, it's a cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional studies, I mean, you may have heard about studies that show that drinking more wine causes cancer, or drinking more wine does not cause cancer. They conflict with each other all the time, and it's because they don't have proper controls and they have confounders in those studies. So you need to look at the better studies, and those are the ones that I'm talking about, which are the quasi-experimental studies that I do. And I have done studies on youth suicide, and as well these firearms legislation in terms of prohibition, storage, etc. And none of those studies have shown there to be a reduction in overall youth suicide rates after the implementation of these legislations or the confiscation of these firearms.
Thank you very much, Dr. Langman. I do want to thank you for the frontline work you do as an emergency physician, even if we may differ on the implications of your research. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison. We'll go now to Mr. Mott, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for being here. Dr. Langman, thank you for your comments in regards to youth deterrence and youth at risk initiatives there. I agree that it's certainly something that needs to be focused on. I'm a firm believer, and I think the evidence is clear, as you've indicated, that Bill C-21 is flawed. Most of the witnesses, and I've only been on this committee again for about 5 or 6 meetings, but most of the witnesses that I've seen at this committee have been critical of aspects of Bill C-21 as is proposed. We've seen that pieces of this legislation are already covered in existing laws, as has been mentioned by many witnesses. It seems to be ideological, based on a fear of firearms. We've seen what can only be described as the complete lack of understanding of sport shooting, recreational airsoft, recreational firearm use at ranges, and the culture that is built around not only safe, but the legal use of firearms. Now, we all have heard the saying that if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And some would think that you can legislate away gun violence. The facts are that those who would use a gun to commit a crime are not likely to care about the laws or the good intentions behind the creation of those laws. So I'm kind of curious. So what practical advice would you give this committee on what we need to do to add to C-21, or is C-21 or sections of it even worthy of saving? Where do we start and what do we need to do to fix it?
I think the sections that I've talked about are, especially the handgun ban is not going to have any effect. The prohibition orders, I have certain concerns about. Currently, the system we have now allows someone to make an anonymous complaint to the CFO, and in my experience, those have been rapidly investigated. This new legislation asks people to stand before a judge and give evidence, and I would state that in my experience working with women at risk, that is one of the most dangerous things that you can have them do. Because there is going to be repercussions. I would suggest rather that we start looking at investment into women's shelters. Women are most at risk when they are about to leave or when they are about to involve the police or another authority in the domestic situation. And so we need to get them out of that situation. And in my experience, working with my patients, very often the women's shelters are filled. So where can those women go? I don't see this new prohibition order having any beneficial effect. I see it acting maybe even more as a boundary or a hindrance to some parties. I think the current system works at acceptable levels. In terms of the handgun bans, like I've said before, and I can just restate myself, there's going to be no beneficial effect. In terms of what we can do, we really need to start looking at root causes. Now, they've mentioned that they've spent some money in some places. Why not spend more? This is going to cost billions of dollars. The buyback of restricted firearms that we talked about last time, we're looking at billions of dollars. And right now, I can't get patients seen for 6 months for psychiatry. I just don't understand why we're not investing in those other areas.
Thank you for your thoughts on that, Dr. Langman. I agree, and I think one of the things that has always, I guess, amazed me since I've been in this place is, while some things may be well intended, the consequence or how we go about it is very backwards. I look at this legislation, and I've heard others describe it, and I would concur that it's lazy legislation. It's easy to go after the low-hanging fruit that have, like you said, a 0.01 of 1% potentially of being a problem, and yet we have known gang violence. We have problems with our Bail Reform Act. We have problems with smuggling. We have youth who are at risk. We have funding to throw around everywhere else, but where the problems really exist. And I'm extremely troubled where this is going, that we spend this effort, time, and resources on a piece of legislation that will have zero impact on public safety, period, currently as it's written. And if there is anything that either one of you gentlemen can add to recommendations of where this legislation needs to be amended and changed, I would encourage you to please forward that to the committee if you haven't already done so. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Mott. We go now to Mr. Nur Mohammed, I believe. 5 minutes.
Thought it was Peter, but okay. Is it me? Okay.
You tell me how.
Perfect. I just want to make sure. No, it's not. Okay, perfect. All right.
Okay,
Well,
5
thank
minutes.
you very much. I want to make sure I'm not taking anybody else's time. Well, thank you for your questions, Professor Longo. I'd like to begin with you. The Vancouver Police Department have shared with us, as well as other police forces, the CACP have shared with us their concerns about ghost guns. And the ability for people to make their own weapons at home and to be able to order parts. One of the opportunities I think for us to consider in C-21 is to start to think about perhaps adding provisions that look at regulating trigger assembly, slides, barrel, so on and so forth. What impact do you think this would have on sort of to the problem of today, but more importantly on solving a problem for policing for tomorrow in terms of gun violence?
Thanks for the question. Okay, so to identify other parts like the barrel, trigger, and the slide, it will make it more difficult for anybody to order parts, make them, and if they're caught making them, they will be caught making a weapon, so they can have bigger jail sentences. Also, they could. It will be easier for the authorities to arrest somebody who is importing those parts in Canada, because for the moment, of course they are part of a weapon, but they are not identified as a weapon if they are by themselves. That's the first thing. The other thing is that not only the government should be thinking about asking firearm producers to give numbers to identification to those parts, but also the Canadian government should think about how to forbid anybody to create or import 3D printing machine that are especially designed to make weapons like the Ghost Runner made in Texas by Defense Distributor. This is one of the best known example, but there are other such devices or machine that are available online. That being said, of course, 3D printing machines, regular 3D printing machines should stay available.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Langman, just turning to you. I mean, you've expressed a particular set of views that I don't necessarily agree with, but perhaps ghost guns is something that we might be able to agree on. Do you think this is a problem going into the future, or do you think that ghost guns are just a passing fancy?
No, I think it's a serious problem going into the future. We're seeing more and more unidentified guns come up in the statistics. I think any restrictions on imports may cause a small reduction in terms of the numbers available, but I suspect that over time there'll be substitute methods of procuring those parts and substitute developments in terms of making those parts in underground markets. Once again, if you don't start targeting the actual root causes, and we're talking about the people that are using these are youth at risk, all right? They get into crime, small crime.
Sorry, Professor, I'm not disagreeing with you on the importance of prevention. I want to confirm that you agree that ghost guns are a problem that we should be thinking about addressing. That's simply what I want. Whether you do or not is what I just simply wanted to know.
I think that it definitely is a problem that's worth addressing, but I think that most of your methods are probably going to be futile in the end.
Thank you. Professor Longwell, going back to your research in this particular area, when you have been speaking to police forces, when you have been looking at sort of trends for the future, when you consider the ease with which parts for ghost guns can be acquired, when you consider the ease with which these weapons can be manufactured at home, what do you see as a trajectory if we don't put a stop to this, if we don't try to take this on head on by ensuring that many of the same provisions placed on firearms are placed on parts?
It will get worse faster, but I think Dr. Langman is right. The problem will grow because it's so much easier to make ghost guns. It got easier to make ghost guns since like 2013 when the first printed gun was made. It was cheap. It would break very easily. But now, very efficient firearms can be printed and made homemade. So of course, the government has to act, to do something to slow this and to show its intent to curb the trafficking of.
Doctor, you've gone on mute, but
yes, I was on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we have to pull a plug there. We go now to Madame Michaud, and we will have to terminate after Mr. Garrison. What's that? So we'll terminate after Madame Michaud. Madame Michaud, allez-y, s'il vous plaît. 2 minutes.
Ms. Michaud, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Langlois, when the government presented its bill, it presented 4 or 5 measures and said that these specific articles will help to fight illegal firearm trafficking. And we found, for example, prolonging maximal sentences for smuggling. And in an article, when you were asked the question, would longer sentences be useful, you had responded, in general, criminals are discouraged by the fear of being caught and not by the severity of the sentences. And I agree with you. William Revet is a young man who had a clean record, and he managed to get 250 firearms over the border and had spent 5 years in prison and then got out. So do you think that it's a measure that will help against smuggling firearms? And if not, what do you think would be a good measure to fight firearm smuggling? Indeed, the case of Mr. Drainville is interesting because he had only spent a few months in prison. He got out in July after trying to bring across the border 250 Glocks. And so, yes, the punishments, in fact, punishment is not the best way to dissuade people from committing crimes. But that being said, I think it's important to remain severe with people who try to import firearms or other dangerous goods that present a threat to public safety. So yes, increasing sentences is not necessarily a bad thing, but the most important, well, how could I say it? Yes, one must enhance surveillance at the border, coordination with the American authorities. That's what I'm focusing on now, how to work on both sides of the border to avoid firearm smuggling. That's the first thing. So yes, in terms of human resources, surveillance, and perhaps sentences as well for those who smuggle arms. The other avenue, and Dr. Langman said this a number of times, we must get down to the cause of the violence. Why are young people, especially men, acquiring firearms in major Canadian cities? Well, there might be an answer there to help us. The problem that I am hearing here, and in general in the media and in the public discussions, is that a bit like in the US, connecting with the question you asked me earlier, it's as if this way of talking about firearms has been imported here. Often firearms are forbidden or we intervene, and both need to be done. There's repression on one hand, but as Dr. Langman was saying, we also have to address the root causes of firearms related violence. And we need to help guide the young people who end up in the cycle of violence. And we have to go to the communities where people need external resources. And a number of programs are possible to be for implementation. I think it's both of those and not one or the other. And then, of course, the budgetary issues have to be taken into account. Thank you very much, ma'am.
This panel, and I thank both witnesses for their wisdom and their experience and their information, and it's a great help to us as a committee. Thank you. We will I just want to remind the committee that the deadline for submission of amendments remains as per the work plan, the 17th. We have one more witness meeting this afternoon, but I would certainly encourage everyone to get their amendments to the legislative clerks as soon as possible in case there's any bottlenecks. And with that, thanks everybody, and we are adjourned.